Saturation is a term in color theory where it describes how colorful an image is. And it's also a term in music production where it describes the same thing, apparently. Because when it comes to saturation, I think over my 13 years that I've been doing music production, I've only really kind of grasped it in the last 4 years. Really ever when I started diving deep into psytrance, I really started to understand what it was doing to my actual sounds. Because before I used to make dubstep and mid-tempo, which are generally more like the type of sound design where you just distort everything. So that didn't really apply to saturation. And really now that I'm going into a genre where you sometimes want to have a little bit of a softer sound, that you still want to have a lot of character and a lot of niceness to it, I would say. I'm trying to not use the term colorful again because I want to try to explain kind of what I said in the intro. But now that I'm dealing with these softer sounds that I want to have more characterful, I really start to need saturation. And I, of course, then need to understand how it really works. So take these particle sounds over here. If I were to solo out an individual element like this, which I sometimes like to do in my mixing process, just to see if I can take an element and just bring it into a little bit of a next level, just give it a little bit of a different sound, see what that does to the mix, just, experiment a little bit. One of the things that I really like to do, of course, is just color it up a little bit, make it a little bit fuller in the frequency spectrum, essentially. Because what saturation in essence does is it takes the frequency content that you have and it's going to take the harmonics and make higher harmonics from them. So you can imagine the sound, if I open up this EQ, is going to be a bunch of sine waves. Many sine waves here. And what we're going to be able to do is we're going to take these sine waves and we're going to create multiples of those sine waves. So there's going to be more stuff higher up in the frequency spectrum. And the way that that is going to work is going to depend on whether you're using even or odd harmonics. And this black box plugin in particular is interesting because it allows you to generate both even and odd harmonics. So even and odd multiples of all of the sine waves that we saw in the spectrum. So that is what is technically happening. But what is really important with saturation is that you just get a feel for what it does to different sounds. And that means that you just need to use it a lot and you need to be able to hear finer details in your music. So of course, personally, what has really helped for me is getting my monitors. Of course, that has given me a lot of clarity in being able to hear exactly what I was doing. And consequently, one of the things that I started doing more is just spending time in these plugins, just twisting with some of the buttons and seeing what happens. So right now we need to turn this on and we're going to use this to just brighten up this sound a little bit, beefing it up a little bit and see if we can get some cool sound out of this. As you can hear, one of the things that we have done is we've set this to low, meaning that it is mainly reacting to more lower frequencies. And you can hear that really dampens the sound. And that doesn't mean that we're now generating more lower frequencies or something like that, or that we're generating like half the frequency of the sine waves or something like that. We're not generating frequencies in this area. The saturation is still just generating new frequencies that are going to be higher multiples than the sine waves that we start out with. What is happening though is that it's going to be generating more from the lower frequencies than it's going to be generating from the higher frequencies. And really internally, the way that something like this is achieved is really simple. We just get ourselves an equalizer and we put it in front of it. And if we want to affect a frequency more, what we do is we set up a boost. So for example, like this, and then we're going to duplicate that over. So we duplicate it over to after here, and then we take our boost This is why I like Melda so much. You can just turn that into a minus. And then I have an exact opposite boost. And now it's going to be boosted going into the saturation. Therefore, this area is already going to be louder and it's going to hit the saturation more. And then both the original frequency boost as well as the phase shift that boost would result in is being cancelled out by this cut over here, meaning that the original frequency balance of the signal is being restored, but the saturation is layered on top, of course. So we are altering the frequency spectrum a little bit with the actual saturation that we're applying, and it's going to be more focused towards this area over here. Now, what is often the case is that it's also cool to layer different saturations. So another saturation plugin that I really like is Lux, because it just comes with two different flavors here, Finesse and Lux, and you can just set an amount and an output gain over here. Now, when it comes to amounts and output gains, we should probably dive a little bit deeper into the technical aspects of saturation. And for that, I've quickly opened up a wave shaper. I'm not going to go over exactly what this graph means. I have longer videos on that. All you need to know is that this is a transfer curve. So you can see that minus 6 dB right now is being transferred to minus 6 dB. And what saturation is going to do is it's just going to slightly increase that. So usually a saturating curve looks somewhat like this. If you have something like distortion, it is going to look much more like this, or even stronger still, something like that. And what this means is that, as you can see, what we're doing with minus 6 dB in this case is we're bringing it up higher in volume. And this is acting on each individual sample of the waveform, which means that we're actually shaping the wave like this, hence the term wave shaper. But this is of course also true for saturation, because as you can see, I can just kind of build a saturation in a wave shaper. It is going to look somewhat like this in terms of the curve. And there are different things involved, like the clipping as well at the highest point over here of this transfer curve. What is going to happen if you exceed 0 dB, for example. But the saturation is just this light act of retransferring the volume and just saying that for every sample that is at minus 6 dB in level, what we're going to do is we're going to lift it up to this value, which is just under minus 3 dB. So one of the things that you'll probably notice is that this plugin has an input and output gain. And that is because that is really useful when you're doing this kind of stuff, to shift the whole signal up and down this axis over here, and therefore also shift where it ends up over here, and therefore also changing where they're going to end up at the output. And of course, then the output is over here to compensate for that. If you're going to drive it into this plugin at, say, 24 dB, you really want to boost it up there, then it's probably going to be useful to do this. And that is, of course, also why all of these plugins come with an output and why you saw me tweak that for quite a long time. And also why now in this Lux plugin, we have to set up the amount and then set up the outputs to compensate for the volume level. Because if I just set up this plugin like this, you can imagine that with it bypassed, it's going to sound very small in comparison to now having this effect. But that's really a little bit of an unfair comparison because it's also much louder. What this amount over here is basically doing is it's just turning up the volume that we're going to go into the saturation with. At least with most saturators, that is the case. I cannot actually confirm that with this particular one. There might be a case that setting up this slider actually changes the transfer curve itself. But in practice, what it usually means for sliders to go up in saturation is that you're going to get louder. And therefore, you need to compensate by turning the volume down. And you can already hear with these two layers of saturation, we get a much more aggressive kind of tonality out of it. I feel like the first one really introduced a little bit of extra mid-range, and the second one really kind of squashed it together and really glued it in an interesting way. And to a certain extent, with saturation, we are also compressing the waveform. Of course, because it is happening in real time and you don't have an attack and release, it is not going to happen like in a groovy way. It's just going to be constantly happening. So you're not going to get that kind of groove altering experience that you're going to get with compressor. But what does happen is that it kind of squashes everything together, and a sound that is maybe very plucky gets a little bit more squared off. And I think that is the effect that we're hearing here. I'm going to check if I like the sound in a full mix. I think I do like it, but I want it a little bit louder to compensate for it. Maybe -7. I think that's going to be okay for now, and I hope that with this video I could give you a little bit of insight in what saturation actually does in a practical way, while also explaining all of the technical things that are involved. If you like this video, make sure that you leave a like, and if you're new here, make sure that you're subscribed. Also, if you have any questions or things that you want me to explain next, make sure that you leave a comment down below. Another way to support the channel is to do so financially, which you can do over on my Patreon page, or by becoming a YouTube member, which you can do right next to the subscribe button. So thank you very much if you choose to do that. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.